I was looking at my phone just a minute ago. We got a message from somebody in France. She said, I like watching your masses, even though the time difference is 6 hours. Well, Giselle, we're glad you're watching our Mass today. And we take great pride and joy that know there are people that watch us in different countries in the world, actually. We have one in France, we have someone in Thailand that watches regularly, and others, so it's nice to see. The gospel really does go all around the world in ways we might not ever imagine. Well, the word resurrection has power. It literally means to stand up again. And it's a reference to the power of God to roll away the stone and to bring the dead back to life. And that's what is my task this morning. I'm supposed to bring them back to life, God is in the resurrection business. And I think that's, if we could grasp that and grasp the implications of that, we would live in an entirely different way than what we live right now. Did you know that there are examples of resurrection in both the Old and the New Testament? For instance, in the Old Testament, if you were to look at 1 Kings 17, you'd read of this widow who provided food and lodging for the prophet Elijah. And she lost her son who had an illness, and her son died, and everybody was blaming Elijah the prophet, Oh, this is your fault. This happened while you were staying there, and so forth and so on. If you really were all that, you'd ask God to save her, to protect her, or to save this son. Well, Elijah took the dead boy from the mother's arms and carried him up to the upper room where he had been staying and laid the boy on the bed, and he prayed, and he stretched himself on the child 3 times. And he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." And the Lord resurrected this child from the dead. Elijah took him to his mother, and the widow proclaimed far and wide that indeed Elijah was the man of God, and that the word of the Lord in his mouth was true. If you flip it over to the next book in the Bible, 2 Kings, there's another example of resurrection. The Shunammite woman's son. This son, he passed away, and the prophet involved was Elisha, who was Elijah's successor. And she summoned Elisha to her house. And when Elisha arrived there, he went to the room where the son was laid out for visitation. He was dead. Elisha rose and went there to that bed and closed the door and prayed to God. And he too stretched himself on the boy's body and the boy's body began to get warm again. Elisha rose then and walked around the room and returned to stretch himself again on the boy's body. And after the boy sneezed 7 times, he arose from the dead. And Elisha took him to his mother. Well, there's a third example of resurrection from the dead in the Old Testament. This is a little interesting. This would be good for a Halloween story, I think. After the prophet Elisha, the one who just did the miracle there, died and was buried, bands of Moabites invaded the land. And they were preparing to bury a man's body near Elisha's grave, and they saw this approaching band of rough and tough Moabites. In haste, they tossed the dead body into Elisha's grave. And when the body touched the bones of Elisha, it came back to life. That's a Halloween story. Ooh, graveyard. But an example that God is in the resurrection business. These 3 examples there in the Old Testament where you might not even expect it. And there it was, that God has the authority over life and death, over sin and redemption. It's all there. Now we turn to the New Testament, of course, and there are three good examples in the New Testament of what Jesus did while he was alive, and he brought three people back from the dead. In Luke's chapter 7, the widow of Nain, her son passes away, and as Jesus enters the town, he crosses paths with the funeral procession. A young man there, the only son of this widow of Nain, had died, and they were carrying him on to the place where he would be laid to rest. Jesus touches the coffin and says, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the young man did. And he began to speak. And Jesus presented him to his mother in Luke 7:15. Jesus healed a girl, Jairus' daughter. The second resurrection in the New Testament provided by Jesus. The synagogue leader, Jairus, approaches Jesus in a crowd, and he begs him to heal his 12-year-old daughter who was in the process of dying. And Jesus was willing, and he sets out to find Jairus' home. And on the way, he was met by a messenger who said that Jairus' daughter had died and there was no need for him to come. But Jesus went anyway. And we read in Luke 8, verse 50, they arrive at the house, and Jesus permitted no one to go in to where the girl's deceased body was, except the girl's parents and Peter, James, and John. And Jesus said to all those who were gathered, "Do not mourn or weep. She's not dead. She is sleeping." And they laughed. And Jesus sent them out. And he took the girl's hand and he said, "Little girl, arise." And her spirit returned to her, and she arose immediately. The second resurrection in the New Testament. You see, God is in this resurrection business. What was dead can be alive again. And so we read the very week before the crucifixion, we read of the story of Lazarus, of a story in John chapter 11 that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. Mary and Martha send word that Lazarus is sick, and won't you come, Jesus, because he's so sick. And Jesus says, "I'll come," and he puts it off. He puts it off on purpose because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that Lazarus is going to die, and he knows that he's going to come and he's going to take care of the business. And so he puts it off, and then finally he gets there 4 days later, and yes, indeed, Lazarus has died. Mary and Martha both say, "You know, Jesus, if you had only been here a couple days ago, he would have lived. But we still know that he'll rise in the resurrection of the dead at the end times." And Jesus says, "Yeah, but I'm the resurrection and the life. Watch this." And he goes to the tomb. There the mourners are still there mourning and crying and carrying on. But Jesus says, "Roll away that stone." And he looks in there, and he didn't knock. Knock, knock, knock. "Are you in there, Lazarus?" He didn't do that because he knew where Lazarus was. But he also knew where he was going to be in just a few moments. And he calls into there, "Lazarus, come forth." And Lazarus comes out. Now, I don't know if it looks like the Bela Lugosi movie or The Mummy. I don't know how it looked. But Jesus says to the crowd, he says, "Cut him loose and set him free." And I'll just tell you about Mr. Lazarus. I did a whole sermon on this, I think, a year and a half ago. Lazarus actually became a star in the early church, and his testimony about coming back from life was so powerful that people became Christians because of their understanding of what Jesus did for him, defeating the grave. And they set out from that point to kill him just in the same way as they set out to kill Jesus. But he later would become a famous bishop in another country, and he would live his life out to its fullest there, preaching and teaching the gospel and creating a wonderful church. You see, God can do great things, even though at first they appear dead, because he's in the resurrection business. Well, today is Easter Sunday. Jesus, of course, was the greatest of all. Greatest resurrection story of all times. I'll tell you, there are two other resurrection stories that just out of grace I'm skipping for you today in the New Testament. One about Tabitha, and then there's another one about somebody who fell asleep in church and fell out the church window and died. And Paul raised him back from the dead, too. I got my eyes on you. Easter Sunday, Jesus rose from the dead, just as he said, fulfilling all the prophecies in the Old Testament about that very event. It looked like he was dead. The devil was celebrating in hell, celebrating about defeating the Son of God, and only to fall right into his trap. Jesus was resurrected, because you can't beat Jesus. I ran across one verse this morning as I was reading along. It comes from Romans chapter 8, verse 11. And half of the verse says this. He's talking about all of us being resurrected from the dead at the end. But the first half of Romans 8, verse 11, says these words, and I'm reading from the Contemporary English Version. Listen to this and let it sink into our heads. Yet God raised Jesus to life. Okay, that's Easter. God's Spirit now lives in you, and he will raise you to life by his Spirit. I'm captivated by that segment of this phrase that said, God's Spirit now lives in you. This same Spirit that gave Jesus the power to be resurrected. That the Spirit of the true and living God resides in the life of every believer. And not only will it give us life eternal, but it will give us God's power for living this life today. His Spirit lives in you. The same Spirit that gave him the power to defeat death. And he's done it for you if you're a believer, and he lives on in your life. You have access to the power of God like you have no imagination. That if we could only grasp this Easter mentality that God's Spirit is within us and that his power dwells in us and that what power is available to us because of this resurrection. Jesus says, I came that you might have life. Resurrection. I once was lost, I once was dead, but now I have life. Jesus says, I've come that you might have life. And then what's the second part? And that you might live it abundantly, fully, maxed out. We live that life abundantly because of the indwelling of God's Spirit in our lives. Because as it says in this passage in Romans, yet God raised Jesus to life. God's Spirit now lives in you, and he will raise you to life by his Spirit. This life by his Spirit is not just in the by and by, but it's in the now and the now. Are you getting it? You see what I'm talking about? Easter is not just for the future. Easter's for right now and how we live. God has given us Jesus Christ that we might live life and live it abundantly. Live it in the Spirit. Operate in the Spirit as God would direct. If his Spirit's within us, didn't he tell you who to marry? He told me who to marry. Boy, he was right on that one. Didn't he tell you sometimes what to do about a job or a place to go or a this or a that? Isn't God's Spirit telling you these things? Doesn't he tell you these? Am I right? Amen? Amen. You see, if his Spirit's in there, that's the same Spirit that gave Jesus power to overcome the grave. If you can overcome the grave, there's nothing you can't do that God puts on your heart to do. Listen, follow, live life abundantly. It puts Easter in a whole awesomer, is that a word? Awesomer way. Oh, thanks be to God for his wonderful gift of his Spirit, Easter Sunday. Let's stand and